Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna have ourselves an orchid seminar. It's a sort of a new series that I want to start, and the concept behind it, it's not new. It's what I used to do many years ago. One of my discussion type videos, which along the years used to be called many different things, such as casual Sundays or discussion or things of the sorts. And today's topic will be pot size. I told you that I would make this topic for a while now. One of the most frequent questions that I get here on my channel is, what pot size should I use with my orchid? And well, as I learned more and I gathered more experience with orchids, I simply do not believe there is such a thing as orchids like tiny pots, or this pot size or the other, or repot one size up or not more, and so on and so forth. And I have very good reasons why I don't want to orient my care around that idea, which we will talk about today. I'm going to explain why and demonstrate some things. And from the get-go, I want to tell you guys that this is not a tutorial. The title is not how to, therefore I'm not going to tell you how to choose the pot size, but we will talk about what influences it and how you can play around with it. So in the end, the point is to have a better understanding about pot size so that you can control the pot size you want to use, not follow some random rules that some random people just post on the internet. It's going to be you who will decide what pot size you need. And this is one of many topics which you guys can actually recommend and suggest down below in the comment section. Let me know also if you like these types of videos, which are not necessarily for beginners and are not necessarily tutorials or updates. But if you know my channel, you know that I like these discussions because in my opinion they lead to better control of your hobby. And if you have better control, you know what rules to bend, what things to apply, what things to disregard at your own will. And that's the point of orchid growing. Not following some rules, but actually understanding what's happening with your orchids and do things that better suit you. Not people on the internet, not me, not other YouTubers, not the American Orchid Society. Alrighty, so do let me know down below in the description what you think about this seminar series and also topics that we can elaborate if you have suggestions. With that said, on with the video. So one of the first things we all research about when we start growing orchids is the repotting subject. What pot to use, what medium to use, when to repot, and other very important details. And many of the times you'll find out that orchids really don't like to be over potted. And when we repot orchids, we should go one size up, not more, maybe two maximum. And there are even entire genera of orchids which supposedly don't like to be over potted. And one of them is the famous Dendrobium orchid. And when I first started to learn about this orchid, one of the main things that I learned about was the pot size and how Dendrobiums hate big pots. And for a long time, I tried to maintain my pots as tiny as possible. Many of the times, though, I found myself in a pickle because my orchid produced so many roots that going one size up didn't cut it. I would have had to remove some of the roots to make the orchid fit. And that's another very common question I get on my channel. If my orchid doesn't fit in the correct pot, can I cut roots? And the answer is no. There is no such thing as correct pot. There is no such thing as making the orchid fit. No. Everything should fit around your orchid, not make the orchid fit into something in particular. So along the years, even though I did follow those rules and I tried to, let's say, be sensible with my pot size, lately I kind of started to throw that idea out the window altogether and just potted all of my Dendrobiums in these big, massive 15-centimeter pots. This is a 6-inch pot for a Dendrobium, and considering the articles, very bad things should have happened to my Dendrobium because I put it in a big pot. But I don't see any downfalls to my decision. So as far as I'm concerned, the decision wasn't really a detrimental one. Furthermore, the orchid is much happier and stays more hydrated, and I have a much easier life when it comes to maintenance and watering mainly. So maybe my orchid is a very special case? Not really. Because apparently all of my Dendrobiums seem to be these very special cases that don't want to abide to the rules. A little PS because I sense the comments coming. It rained last night, that's why there's water in the pot and water on the orchids. And these orchids sit outside, so pretty much they got a good watering. After this video is done, the water can simply be dumped out from the decorative pots. And it's really not about trying to be different and bending the rules and being rebellious or anything of the sorts. But it is downright about having an easier life with orchids. Obeying some rules which have been imprinted in my mind from the beginning simply did not make my life better with these orchids. It made it more hassling, because every decision we make will have consequences. And one of the consequences with tinier pots generally is less water retention. And while for some people that can work out, for other people, such as myself, it really doesn't work out all that well. Because not only the environment is an issue here, but also the orchid growing. At some point, it will become pot-bound. And at that point, it will drink a lot more water than typical, or at least how it was when you first started. And that can become problematic if you don't have a lot of time at your disposal. And the more I actually tried to explain why some articles say orchids don't like this and don't like the other, or love this and love the other, I simply couldn't find a good explanation. It certainly was not good enough for me, hence why I don't think it's good enough to put out on YouTube. The more I played around with orchids, the more I discovered that orchids absolutely do not care about pot size. They don't like tiny pots. They don't hate big pots. What affects them most is the environment inside this container. Orchids don't have eyes to see if the pot is big or tiny, but they do have the ability to detect what's going on in their environment. They detect temperature, humidity levels, they even detect hard surfaces, water chemistry parameters, and many other things which don't directly have to do with pot size, but with what's inside the pot. And to visually demonstrate my proposed idea, let me show you something. So here we have a 15 centimeter pot. This is about 6 inches. Here we have my tiny Tillumnia orchid. Let's imagine that I pot up this orchid in this pot. Would you say that it is overpotted? Yes, you obviously would. It's massively overpotted. This is such a big pot for such a tiny orchid, we will definitely have issues. I'm not gonna say what type of issues, but we will have issues if we intend to use this pot with this orchid. Fair enough. But now imagine this. I place my orchid not in the pot, bare-rooted, on the side of the big pot, and I place no medium inside the pot. Would you say it's overpotted now? Maybe not, because in the end, this orchid will not be potted, it will be rather mounted, because mounting orchids doesn't necessarily imply a flat surface. We can mount orchids on a piece of wood, on a water cylinder, why not? We can choose different materials as well, because orchid roots grow very well on surfaces which don't damage the roots if they have air and water. Plastic is a very good material for the roots, even some metals, and even the wall. If roots get on the wall, they will start climbing it. And not only, fake grass appears to be a very suitable material as well. And this is because the roots don't really care what type of material that mount is. Yes, of course, in nature they grow on trees because we don't have walls in nature. But if you know me, you know that my idea of the ideal medium has to be one that can provide water, can provide air, and is suitable and not damaging for the roots, from a chemical and physical point of view. Now, if we take care about the watering, mounted orchids respect all of those rules. And if the material doesn't damage the root system, then the orchid grows absolutely fine on any type of mount, any type of shape, any type of non-damaging material. So, putting my orchid on the side of the pot like this equals mounting. But it is potted still. What's the difference? The difference is the medium inside. If we imagine that the medium inside the pot is bark and moss, then yes, it is overpotted. But if we imagine that the medium inside the pot is air, then it's suddenly not overpotted. That's a little bit of a paradox, isn't it? So bottom line, orchids don't really care about the size of the pot. They care about what's inside the pot, how airy it is, how suffocating it is. And sure, pot size can determine certain parameters inside, but this is only if we think about the same type of medium. Yes, this medium in this tiny pot is suitable, but if I would use this mixture in the big pot, yeah, it will be a little too wet for this orchid because pot size influences that. However, if I switch up the medium in that big pot to something which does not retain any bit of water, you know what? All of a sudden, that big pot becomes fantastic for my little orchid. Now, the articles suggesting that you don't use two big pots are not totally incorrect. It's really hard to comprise such a detailed and maybe complex idea to orchid beginners. So the safest thing to do and to write in an article is to say, hey, don't use two big pots, they might retain too much water, rather than elaborating on the medium, the qualities of the medium, and everything that I just told you. So really, what the articles say and what we sometimes say, it's actually good advice. But as we advance in the hobby, there are things that we simply need to let go because those things speak to beginners. They're simple, they're attractive to beginners, but they're not necessarily correct. And after a while spent in the hobby in which you got to experiment with types of medium, you got to learn about your environment and the lifestyle that you have in regards to your orchid, it is a very, very good idea to start forgetting about these beginner rules and going a little bit more in depth and seeing what exactly happens. So you know if you can actually make some adjustments which will benefit your orchid and you. So, being that we established that pot size doesn't really have much to do with what the orchid likes, but the environment inside the pot definitely does, well, at this point we can play around with the different types of media. We can play around with less water retentive media, which we can combine with bigger pots, or more water retentive media, which we can combine with smaller pots. We can do mixtures, we can make things work for us, rather than making us work for the orchid and the hobby itself. And there are actual practical instances in which pot size and the type of medium and how you combine them can actually give you greater results than if you just follow an article word by word. And one example of that, which I think we all face at some point, is the growth of sympodial orchids. One of the reasons why we need to repot these orchids, except media deterioration, is growth of these orchids. At some point, they will just spill out of the pot, they will grow roots in the air, which is okay because they're epiphytic orchids, it's normal and nothing bad will happen, but you will have to water the orchid more frequent. Since roots are not in the water retentive medium, they're in the air. So at some point, if you let this go on too long, you will find that most of the healthiest roots will be outside needing more water than the older roots inside the pot, which don't really function all that well anymore. So you will be forced to repot at some point. And many times when we buy new orchids or we receive orchids, the root systems are nowhere to be found because orchids sometimes lose their root systems, but it's okay, they grow them back. So in some instances, you will find yourself with a pretty rootless orchid that has a lot of growth up top, which is the case with this orchid. Can we see any root inside? No, we can't. I just received this orchid about 2 weeks ago. Now, there are some roots inside the pot, somewhere in the middle, but definitely there aren't enough to justify the size of the pot if we are to take into account what the article suggests. However, up top, can we see that this orchid is already kind of taking over the pot already? And this is a 15 centimeter pot or 6 inches. It's not a tiny pot. Well, at this point, what do? Get a tiny pot to accommodate the roots snug like the article suggests, or go with a pretty big pot for 2 roots, just because that big pot accommodates the entire orchid. Well, presuming we don't want to divide it, we will have to go with the bigger pot. You could say, well, I can go with a shallow pot, wide but not so deep. Well, yeah, but in a few months, this orchid will create a ton of roots and you will need to repot again. So what do? We're back to the big pot situation once again. And the more you calculate the problem, the more you will see that it will be so much better to just repot this orchid into a big pot, get it over with, not having to disturb this orchid after a few months, and just let it be, grow, do its thing, not set it back. How do we use a very big pot for this orchid if the article says we shouldn't? Well, with a bit of know-how, with a bit of mixing up the medium so that it is not very, very, very water retentive, but also it's not very, 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 very dry either, unless we want to. So I think you get the idea that I'm trying to aim at. The more you make the medium airy, the less wet the pot will be, no matter the size. And of course, a bigger pot and a smaller pot using the same type of medium will have a difference. The bigger pot will dry out slower. But if we change the medium, things can actually be totally opposite. We can have a big pot drying faster than the tiny pot. Again, if we know how to mix or what type of medium to use. And of course, if we don't put inside any medium, this pot will dry out within a few seconds. So in the end, is it really about the pot size or what's inside the pot? It's what's inside. The pot size is indirectly responsible for what's inside. This is one of the concerns with using big pots. Roots will get suffocated, you're gonna get root rot, and very, very bad things will happen. But it's not the only reason people try to associate with pot size. Another reason is better blooming or better growth. Apparently, orchids bloom better if they're potted in smaller pots, which again, I tried to follow, but in my experience, it's just not the case. And along the years, I did try to find some answers, such as, well, orchids like to attach to stuff. But in the end, orchids actually attach to the medium itself as well. It's not just the pot, it's the entirety of the medium and the pot. And also, how do we explain that some orchids are grown bare-rooted, not even mounted, and they still bloom nice and they still do good? I cannot say that roots attaching to something will yield better flowers if I have examples that contradict me out there, right? So that's not the direction that I want to go at. What I want to look at is the basics. How do they actually grow in nature? Now, orchids, or their ancestors, because these are hybrids, developed just like any other plant. They evolved according to their environment, to whatever they found around them. They adapted ways to better survive, and they also developed features which give them the edge in the fight for survival in nature, right? So everything that they developed was to help them better survive. So let's think a little bit about small contained pots, small environments. Is there something in their natural habitat of their ancestors which will make them perform better or feel more at home in tinier contained spaces, in tinier pots? Do they actually have morphological adaptations to tiny little pots? Is that even possible? Well, I think no. If we think about epiphytic orchids, which are the vast majority of our orchids, we know that they do grow on the tree trunk, and that is nothing like a tiny pot. It's quite the opposite. It's a lot of space for the roots to just grow. And if you have older orchids in your collection which continuously grow some roots, you know that they can reach to tremendous lengths. So in nature, their environment is be free, grow as much as you want. And in cultivation, it's tiny pots. That's what they love. Something doesn't really give. I personally do not find any morphological development on an orchid that screams, we like tiny pots. And I'll give you an example of a morphological transformation. Example, epiphytic orchids have velaments, or better said, the roots have velaments. This is a morphological adaptation which arose due to the very airy and very water deficient environment in which they are found. Most of them, as I was saying, growing on trees, branches, and above the soil in any case. Sure, they can find a little bit of moss here, a little bit of debris here, but you cannot compare these orchids to a perfectly terrestrial plant. And at the same time, you cannot compare their roots with a terrestrial plant's roots. And I'm not talking about other orchids which might be semi-terrestrial or might come from very airy soils. Take the root of this orchid, compare it to the root of a tomato, and you will see a difference. And not only that, the root of an epiphytic orchid has no issues growing into the air, while the root of the tomato will just die in the air. There's actually a growing concept around that. It's called air pruning. I'll link you to it down below. It's an interesting concept. So here is an example of how the environment determined a morphological difference. And when I say this, I actually mean the structures that are present on orchids, these formations and how they act and they behave. And this is just an example. On an orchid, we can find all sorts of examples that have to do with the morphology. For example, the shape of the flowers, the fragrance, the shape of the leaves, the cuticle of the leaves, the pseudobulbs, the flower spikes. All of these structures developed according to the environment in which these orchids are found. And since in nature, most of these orchids actually are free to just grow on trees, are not contained within a very tiny space, then what is the morphological adaptation to very, very tiny and confined places? Because I cannot find that structure that screams, I like a tiny pot. In my opinion, there is none. There is nothing about this orchid that adapted to life in a very, very tiny pot. So this idea has nothing to do with what these orchids are adapted to in nature. It has to do with our cultivation. And since our cultivation relies on finding a medium for these orchids, well, I think it kind of comes full circle. I think everything makes sense. And I think not only does it make sense, I think it can explain how some people can grow orchids in baskets, massive pots, and all sorts of other types of setups, and apparently working okay. Because at the end of the day, what shaped these orchids most was the availability of water, availability of air, and the supports which were safe for their roots chemically and physically. And these things just happen to be my 3, let's say, rules for finding adequate medium: water, air, and not damaging media or supports. Now, does this mean that everybody should use big pots or small pots or this or the other? No, because there are things which will influence how a setup will perform, things such as temperature, humidity, amount of air movement, amount of fresh air, duration of the day, duration of seasons, and so on and so forth. Very, very many reasons why something will work differently between us. For some people, underpotting could be the solution. For other people, overpotting, again quotation marks, will just give the orchids what they need. So in the end, it is incorrect to say that this size of the pot is what you should be using, or this or the other, and so on and so forth. Because if I change one parameter in my environment, including medium, then everything just goes out of place. Yeah, sure, this pot size is not okay if I put only sphagnum moss in it, but if I put only bark, is it okay? Well, yeah, it actually is okay. It's better. If the problem was water retention, hey presto, I could solve the issue without changing the pot size. But maybe I do want to use sphagnum moss, so I will compromise. I will use a smaller sized pot and suffer the consequences of that if there are any, and so on and so forth. It is actually a decision. And again, for beginners, it is okay to say don't place orchids in very big pots, because there are so many details that anybody would be overwhelmed. I was as well. But the more you get into the hobby, the more you might see an idea here, an idea there, a person growing their orchids in this style, a person growing their orchids in that style, the more you should understand that, hey, you know what? You can grow this orchid however you feel best. Again, as long as you maintain the 3 golden rules, which you don't have to follow, but I find are very, very important: air, water, and again, that safe medium, be it air. Air is a very, very safe medium to grow your orchids in. So in my opinion, this is what makes that whole polemic and whole discussion about pot size simply irrelevant. If another grower is perfectly comfortable and grows their orchid perfectly fine and safe in a 4-gallon container, who am I to tell them that's too big? You should not use that, it's too big. How would I know what type of medium they use, what type of environment they use, if they don't necessarily show me or tell me more about it? Just saying, no, this is not good, pot size is not good because an article says so, that's silly, isn't it? I don't want to do that anymore. I used to think that way, and maybe in the past I used to say it sometimes as well, because everybody said it. All the experts said it. Dendrobiums like tiny pots, but no, they don't. They absolutely don't. And if you want to put them in a bucket, do so. But just make sure that the environment is okay in that bucket. So to wrap it all up, it's not a wrong idea to talk about pot size, but we need more details. We need to know the big picture of everything, and then we can advise a person to use bigger or smaller pots. If we know particularities and details, then yeah, sure, we can express an opinion. But just going around and saying, nope, this is not good because the article says so, that's not really correct. And in the end, it's kind of silly to do. And there are rules which I think should be followed. To me, they're not necessarily rules, but they're logical deduction. The whole air, water, safety thing about the medium, that's something that I do care about a lot. And because I care about it, I am going to advise others to always keep in mind air availability, water availability, whether you provide the water or the medium maintains it. and also safety of the medium. But as far as pot size is concerned, it has nothing to do with these rules that derive from the way orchids adapted to live in the wild. Hence, I don't focus all that much on the subject, other than I need a big enough pot to maintain this orchid at least 2 years or so in that pot. If it's gonna outgrow it in a few months, not for me. And also a space-saving issue, but other than that, I prefer to really work with the medium than with the pot size. And with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this seminar. I do have some more ideas prepared. I will talk about root adaptation to media. I have them in my phone. So root adaptation to media, different types of media, and I do think I have some other ideas here. But of course, if you have suggestions of these topics that we can dissect, then let me know in a comment down below. And with that said, you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you wish to support the channel, do consider visiting the merch store down below. So I'll see you next time. Bye!